Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second meeting of the Turba online discussion group on the history of alchemy, broadly defined. This autumn, we will be meeting roughly every other week on Fridays. The format is flexible to range from presentations to talks, roundtables, debates. We are fortunate to have secured the support of the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, which has kindly helped publicize this and is providing its Zoom account and YouTube account for our use. I should add that this meeting will be actually broadcast online on the Shack YouTube channel. Before I begin, just some quick administrative matters. To the best extent possible, if you can keep your video on and the sound off. I will be taking questions either in the chat or if you can raise your hand virtually or physically, I should be able to see it. If you have questions on YouTube, please also put them in the chat box and I will try to catch it. I would add that Dagmar will be offering a talk, which is about 40-45 minutes, and we'll start the discussion afterwards. I aim to keep the meeting of up to 1 hour and a half, less if there are not a lot of questions. Now let me introduce our speaker today, Dagmar Wujastyk. Dagmar is Associate Professor in History, Classics and Religion at the University of Alberta in Canada. From 2015 to 2020, she was the principal investigator of the Ayur Yoga project, which examined the historical connections and entanglements between the South Asian disciplines of yoga, Ayurveda, and alchemy. She is the author of Well-Mannered Medicine, Oxford University Press 2021, so just appeared, a study on medical ethics and etiquette in classical Ayurveda, and the editor of several volumes on the Indian medical and alchemical traditions. She is currently editing a source book of Indian alchemy, which we look forward to, with translations from a range of Sanskrit alchemical texts. Dagmar, please.
I can just say the Well-Mannered Medicine was actually 2012. I think I may have, there was a typo there about when it appeared. So it's a...
Sorry, I was looking forward to just get it now.
Well, it's still, you can still buy it, but yeah, it's not quite that recent. So in recent years, I've been editing quite a few volumes on alchemical matters, the most recent one being a volume called Transmutations, about various Asian alchemical traditions and yogic traditions.
We look forward to the source book for certain,
yeah,
on Indian alchemy.
Yeah, I'll be talking about that a little bit now. So thank you, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to talk about the Indic alchemical traditions. So I have prepared this talk with the assumption that most of you will not be very familiar with the Indic disciplines and their history. So I thought I would start with quite a general introduction that includes a little information on secondary literature and resources. And then I'll talk about the primary sources and the general trends, as it were, in the history of Indian alchemy as reflected in this literature. So let me begin by sharing my screen, and I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will share with you.
Ho iniziato, Marina, scusa.
Okay, start from first slide. So here we go. Can you all see this PowerPoint presentation now? Yeah, okay. So I myself can only see a few people. So if you want to ask questions or say something, you'll have to unmute yourself and just feel free to interrupt me if you like. I can take questions anytime. I didn't time myself for this talk, so if I'm getting a bit too long, just let me know and I'll stop a bit earlier. Okay, so let's begin. Indic alchemy. So there are several traditions that would could be categorized as alchemy, various traditions that developed on the Indian subcontinent or that started there and then moved to other places. And probably the earliest tradition that I should mention is one that is referred to as Dhatu Vada, which translates as the doctrine of probably metals and minerals. So we have reference to a Dhatu Vada in various narrative literatures, Buddhist, Jain. We also have mention of Dhatu Vada in some plays, in Sanskrit plays. And these date from about the 4th century, but most occur around the 6th, 7th, and 8th century. And so this Dhatu Vada seems to have been an early tradition focused on making gold and silver. We know very little about it, so all that we know about it is from these narrative literature. So it's always from an outsider's viewpoint, more often than not from a very critical viewpoint, very often describing it as a fraudulent practice. And then we have works written in Sanskrit that are focused on mercury. And this is the beginning of alchemical literature proper. So in other words, works written by alchemists for alchemists. And as I said, these are works written in Sanskrit, and I'll talk more about those later, so I'll leave this here for now. There's a further tradition that is very strongly linked with the Sanskritic one, but whose works are all written in Tamil, the South Indian, a Dravidian language. And these texts are representative of the Tamil Siddha tradition or Siddhar tradition. These works are also focused on the uses of mercury, but they also focus on special salts, so something that is more local to the South Indian tradition, and they integrate medicine, alchemy, and yoga. So there has been a little bit of work on this tradition, and I haven't worked on it because I don't read Tamil. The person who has been working most on it is Ilona Kanzia, who is at Jagiellonian University in Krakow in Poland. And there has also been some, because it's a living tradition, some anthropological work done by Brigitte Sébastien, who is at the French Institute at Pondicherry, or at least was when she was conducting this research. Going back a little bit in time again, we also have reference to something called Loha Vada. If you remember the Dhatu Vada, so we have a Loha Vada. Vada means doctrine, and Loha means probably iron in this case. It can also mean metal more generally, but here it probably means iron, because this is a tradition that focuses on iron, on the uses of iron for transmuting matter and so on. And this Loha Vada is referenced in both medical and in alchemical works. And when I say alchemical works, I mean these works written in Sanskrit that usually focus on mercury, but they sometimes mention a Loha Vada. We also have a few single treatises dedicated to Loha Vada. These are as yet untranslated, and we don't really know very much about their contents. So there's some work to be done there in future. There may be remnants of this tradition. So it may survive in contemporary Vaisalam practices in Myanmar, so Burmese alchemy, as it were. Burmese alchemy is a really fascinating subject. It usually also focuses on the uses of mercury, and it's all in a modern Theravada Buddhist context. People working on it at the moment include Céline Coderet and also Patrick Pranke. There are also others who are looking at this living tradition. So I think that maybe some of the iron-based focuses of this tradition may go back to the Sanskritic Loha Vada, the doctrine of iron. And then finally, I would like to mention translations of Sanskrit alchemical works into Tibetan, which then entered the Buddhist canon, so the Kanjur and Tenjur, under these sort of keywords of Chulen and Rasayana. So Chulen is supposed to be a translation of the Sanskrit word Rasayana, but it translates as extraction of essences. And so we have some, so the texts themselves in Tibetan say that they are translations of Sanskrit works on alchemy. However, most of these are no longer extant in the Sanskrit original, but the contents are very clearly of the same tradition. So that's the sort of wider picture of traditions or disciplines that we could sort of call Indic alchemy. And so I would like to talk about the Sanskritic tradition because I am a Sanskritist, so these are the texts that I have access to. And they're also the earliest sources on Indian alchemy from within the tradition. So texts written in Sanskrit. And these texts, we use the word alchemy to describe the tradition. In the texts themselves use various terms for their discipline, including Rasa Shastra, which translates as the discipline of Mercury. So Shastra is something like discipline. Rasa is Mercury in this case. Rasa Vidya, the knowledge about Mercury. Rasa Vada, there we have the Vada again, so the doctrine of Mercury. And then we have the word Rasayana, the path possibly of Mercury. That term is never used to describe the tradition as a whole in the Sanskrit alchemical texts. It is, however, used by outsiders to the tradition. So, for example, when Al-Biruni visited India, he also thought he witnessed some alchemists and their practices, and he calls their practice Rasayana. And then the final word, Raseshwara Siddhanta, is one that you won't come across very often, the doctrine regarding the Lord of Essences, but that's just another word that is found at least once to describe the tradition. So what you can see, the discipline of Mercury, the knowledge of Mercury, the doctrine of Mercury, and so on, this is a tradition that really centers on the various uses of Mercury, which is really kind of surprising because there is no Mercury on the Indian subcontinent. There's also no cinnabar, so this is a material that had to be imported, at least to my knowledge. So I hope to do some field work in the future to see whether there are maybe just some small amounts found here and there, maybe in volcanic areas of India that would account for this growing of this tradition centering on Mercury, because it is something somewhat surprising, especially given the earlier focus on Dhatuvada, which did not use Mercury. Okay, so an important thing to know about this tradition is that it is a living tradition because parts of it survive in India today, also on Sri Lanka and also Pakistan and Bangladesh and so on. But it survives as Rasa Shastra, as a subdivision of Ayurveda, of classical Indian medicine. So perhaps starting from the knowledge that in India, the medicine, it does not just mean biomedicine or modern medicine, it also includes indigenous forms of medicine like Ayurveda, like Unani, like Siddha. This is government-regulated education and practice. You can study these forms of medicine at university and get a degree. Rasa Shastra here survives as a subdivision of Ayurveda, of this modern form of classical Indian medicine. So a number of universities in India have Ayurveda departments with a subdivision for Rasa Shastra. So for example, there's the department of Rasa Shastra at Benares Hindu University. There's a department of Rasa Shastra at Gujarat Ayurveda University at Jamnagar. There's some colleges that offer courses in Rasa Shastra. And it is just, if you study Ayurveda at university, Rasa Shastra is one of several subjects in the curriculum for attaining the degree of Bachelor of Ayurvedic Medicine and Surgery, BAMS, and it's also an area of specialization for graduate studies. So you can do a doctorate in Rasa Shastra, and of course this is about pharmacology and the practice of medicine. It's not about making gold or becoming immortal or so, as is the aims described in the earliest of the works. So Rasa Shastra formulations are today still used extensively by Indian pharmaceutical companies for over-the-counter products. So while, within modern Indian commercial and governmental institutions, Rasa Shastra is considered a subsidiary branch of Ayurveda, historically it was a discipline in its own right. But just looking at the pharmacological products, here on the right, you can see a product called Makaratvaj. And so the recipe for this formulation, which is it's almost a panacea, but it's generally used for sort of general vitalization, for general well-being, I would say. So the first time this formulation is described is in a 1,000-year-old Rasa Shastra text. So you can see that, these formulations, some of them, not all of them, are still used today by the big pharmaceutical companies specializing on indigenous medicines like Dabur, like Baidyanath, and so on. There are other examples. Now, this medicine is a particularly famous one. It's based on mercury and sulfur and often also contains gold. And as you can see at the bottom right, also pearl and so on. So there's sort of special formulations. So just to say that these formulations are still relevant today, and also the methods of their production as first described in the historical works. So I'd like to move over to just give you an idea of who has actually worked on the history of alchemy in India. And so it's not been a part that has been sort of widely covered in Indological studies, but there has been some work beginning really with Prafulla Chandra Rai's History of Hindu Chemistry, which he published in several editions between 1902 and 1909. Prafulla Chandra Rai was an industrialist, and so he had a chemical, pharmaceutical production and so on, but he was very inspired by Berthelot and by Berthelot's history of alchemy. And he wanted to do something like that for the history of alchemy in India, except he didn't want to call it alchemy. He wanted to place it within a scientific or proto-scientific context. So therefore the title History of Hindu Chemistry. And this work gives an introduction to the Rasa Shastra literature with a focus on the development of chemistry. So he leaves out all religious and cultural elements in the works and just focuses on things that we could just see as, the chemical knowledge. So it contains examples of a number of chemical processing methods and also of knowledge of certain substances, for example, zinc. But it also includes citations, and these are our earliest translations into English from several of the oldest Sanskrit alchemical treatises. And also significantly, it establishes a chronology of the alchemical works. And this chronology of which work comes first and which follows and so on, still more or less stands today. So this was important work that he did. The work also contains a lot of diagrams of the apparatuses used. So it's very useful to get a sort of general idea of what this practice looked like. And you can find it on archive.org, so it's freely available as something to look into the tradition. Then probably the work that fulfills what Prafulla Chandra Rai did not do, namely talk about the religious and cultural aspects of the practice, is fulfilled by David Gordon White's The Alchemical Body, published in 1996, and I think it was Dr. White's PhD thesis at the time. So this is probably the classic work on Indian alchemy to date. And it focuses on the alchemical texts, soteriological teachings and esoteric practices. So he looks a lot at the Shaiva context, so the Hindu practices focused on the main deity of Shiva, and especially the tantric forms, so the uses of mantras, the uses of mandalas and magical diagrams and words and sounds of power and so on, and how that fits in with the wider Hindu Shaiva worldview. So he gives an account of the links of Indian alchemy with tantric traditions, pointing to shared theoretical and theological foundations. He also posits connections with Hatha yoga in terms of shared concepts, and to a much lesser degree, common body of literature. But definitely there are a lot of shared authorities in the figures of the siddhas, the authorities, the masters of alchemy, and the masters of yoga. A work that I use a lot, have used a lot in the past, is Jan Gerrit Meulenbeld's History of Indian Medical Literature. So this is a 5-volume work that he worked on for over 30 years, the late Jan Meulenbeld. It lists hundreds of both medical and alchemical works. And so for the alchemical works, he gives synopses of a great number of important Rasa Shastra works, and that's hugely useful. It's, however, not very useful if you're a beginner to the subject, because he basically leaves all the technical terms in Sanskrit. So he has Mardana and Murchana and all these sort of technical terms. So if you don't yet know about the technical terms, it will be difficult to work your way through his synopses of the texts. But it's still, if you do know a little bit, this is such a useful work to give you an overall sense of what a work contains. And in my project, we used Jan Melnbeld's synopses a lot for our alchemy timeline, or our timeline of Sanskrit alchemical literature, which I'll be showing you a little bit later. So this timeline was curated by Dr. Patricia Sautoff, who was a postdoctoral researcher on my project, and myself. And I'll go back to that in a little bit. But I do want to show you two more sources, and one is Oliver Helwig's Wörterbuch der mittelalterlichen indischen Alchemie. So it's in German, it's the dictionary of medieval Indian alchemy. And from a book review that I found, let me quote, everything you ever want to know about the technical material side of medieval Indian alchemy. So it's a very good complementary volume to David Gordon White's book, which does not talk about the technical side of things at all. So this work discusses terms, apparatuses, materials, and it always gives references to primary sources and translations of key passages. And that's really key for you to see, in what way is a technical term used. So it's hugely useful if you can read German. Oliver Helwig, so this is, so 2009. And at the same time, Oliver Helwig was making a database, the digital corpus of Sanskrit. It used to contain, so this is online. If you put in the search word digital corpus of Sanskrit, you can find it. It's online, and it used to contain mostly alchemical works, and it was hugely useful because you can put in a query for a word, and I put in here Makaradvaj, just the name of the medicine that I mentioned earlier, and then you can see what the distribution of this word is in the works, in the text that he lists there. Now he has many other texts that are non-alchemical in this database, but you can still find, where they occur and how they occur. And this is what it looks like when you actually look at a text. So here I chose the Rasarnava, an 11th to 12th century Sanskrit text. And you can see that he has here chapter 1, and it's transcribed into Roman script. One thing that used to be better about it, he moved this database over to another place, and used to be that you could find parallels in a text. So if another alchemical text had, or even another Sanskrit text had parallels to the sentence, you would be able to click on this and get a parallel. Unfortunately, that function no longer works. It was hugely useful to see quotations within the body of literature. And I think, I don't know whether he will have time to work on it. He's sort of moved on from alchemy, but maybe, I hope that one day this function will be reinstated. Okay, the last source that I want to talk about was the already mentioned Indian Alchemy Reader, or Source Book of Indian Alchemy. And that is forthcoming, so it's in peer review, or will be in peer review very, very soon. And so this is a volume that I am editing, and that was part of my project. I don't want to go through all the chapters here, but basically what this does is give, we chose 10 different alchemical sources, Indian Sanskrit alchemical sources, and shows a chapter representative of a particular theme that is typical for Indian alchemy, and then translated that chapter and give a general introduction to both the chosen work and the theme of the chapter, to give people a sort of overview and a real taste of this literature. So, fingers crossed it will be out sooner rather than later, but it's not quite there yet. Okay, last thing I want to show you on my PowerPoint is a manuscript of, in this case, the Rasendra Mangala, which actually my husband, Dagmar Wujastyk, is working on for his chapter in the Alchemy Reader. So we have print editions of quite a lot of the alchemical works, but many more are not actually available as editions, and none of the editions we have are actually critical editions. So Dominic is making a critical edition of one of the chapters of the Rasendra Mangala from a manuscript such as this. So this is a paper manuscript. This is very unusual in that it contains images of apparatuses. And that's something that we don't actually have very often on these manuscripts, neither for the medical nor the alchemic ones. They don't usually have pictures, but several of the Rasendra Mangala manuscripts have such images. So that's a very interesting thing. So usually you just have text with descriptions of the things rather than pictures. Okay, and now I had a few more, but I'm going to leave those out and actually leave my PowerPoint because I would like to now talk a little bit more about what this literature looks like. Can I just confirm, Joe, can you now all see the timeline? Is that?
Let's see.
Otherwise, let me stop my share and then reshare again. Okay, I'm just going to stop the share. And now I'm going to share my screen again, desktop 2.
Yeah, it works. Yeah, it's fine now.
Okay, here we go. So I would like to talk a little bit about what this Rasa Shastra literature looks like. And so this is why I want to move over to this timeline made by Patricia Saltov and myself for the Ayur Yoga project. So you can find it here, ayuryog.org/alchemy timeline. So this is a timeline of Sanskrit alchemical literature. It's not comprehensive. We didn't list every single work that we know of, just the most important ones. I think we listed about 20 works and a few Ayurvedic works with significant iatrochemical content. So I would like to start with just talking about what this literature, how this literature developed. So in the 10th century of the Common Era, alchemists in India began to compose works in Sanskrit about their craft, defining both its goals and the methods with which to achieve them. And this new genre of literature, so this is a completely new genre, set practices that were previously the stuff of legend within a framework of an authoritative discipline with formal boundaries. The practitioners of this discipline considered goals such as making gold, lengthening lifespan, attaining superhuman powers called siddhi, and entering transcendent states achievable through technical means, and especially through a curated use of enhanced substances, mercury in particular. Now, Indian alchemists developed a set of procedures they believed would transform inorganic and organic materials into substances with the power to transmute base metals to noble ones. We're talking, lead to gold or to silver, copper to gold, and so on, and ordinary humans into perfected beings. At the same time, alchemical products could also be applied in this worldly ways, such as in the treatment of disease or to counter age-related conditions, forming a subdiscipline of iatrochemistry that over time became the dominant feature of Indian alchemy, as you saw earlier with modern forms of Rasa Shastra. So the work shown here on the timeline, the Rasa Hridaya Tantra, the Heart of Mercury, marks the beginning of this genre of alchemical literature proper. So works on alchemy written by alchemists themselves to describe their craft. It was followed by a work called the Rasarnava, the Ocean of Mercury, which I'll show you in a minute. And these two works really constitute the starting point of this genre. Now, the early Rasa Shastra works display some differences in how they portray this discipline, and the later works echo and then develop these differences, adding their own distinctive characteristics and emphases. So later works always quote or paraphrase from the earlier ones. That's how we can talk about it as a tradition in the first place. They all relate to what they say to each other. One of the significant differences between the early alchemical works lies in their narrative frameworks. So the Heart of Mercury's author, Govinda, dedicates his summary of the craft in 506 verses to the king of the Kiratas, whom he refers to as a master on the subject of Mercury, Rasacharya. Acharya is a teacher or a master. So here, one expert is speaking to another, soberly delivering learned précis on a practical discipline with soteriological aims that is familiar to both. The stated soteriological aims include liberation in a living body, and the word here is jivan mukti, so that's a sort of important keyword for the Indian alchemical tradition, but also the attainment of the absolute or supreme spirit, which is here in this work named Brahman. Notably, the Heart of Mercury does not display strong sectarian affiliation, and it's actually the only work within this body of literature that is not emphatically Shaiva. So Shaiva refers to a Hindu tradition in which the ultimate godhead is Shiva, or a form of Shiva. So although this work is very systematic in its structure, it describes a program of making a mercurial elixir, the Heart of Mercury is not a guide to practice, but rather a statement on what the discipline's activities consist of and what their purpose is. So it stakes a claim for alchemy as an authoritative body of knowledge, a shastra, the Sanskrit word of shastra, an authoritative body of knowledge that is grounded in expert knowledge and established methods. Now, if we look at the other work that I mentioned earlier, which was the Rasarnava, the other important starting point for the alchemical tradition, 11th or 12th century, this work is firmly placed in a Shaiva setting, as are more or less all later works. It's presented as a dialogue between Shiva and his consort Parvati, and Shiva instructs Parvati on alchemy, presenting it as esoteric knowledge. So here Mercury is a manifestation of Shiva as the absolute in the form of his essence and actually his semen, and must be worshipped. The Rasarnava, the Ocean of Mercury, is a much longer treatment of the subject. It has 2,300 verses, if you compare that to the just above 500 of the Heart of Mercury. And therefore it includes many elements that are missing entirely in the Heart of Mercury, such as the auspicious positioning and setup of the laboratory, lists of instruments used in alchemical operations, the initiation, the tantric initiation of the alchemist, the desired characteristics of the persons involved in the alchemical endeavor, and the use of mandalas, so sort of magical diagrams, as it were, mantras, words of power, sounds of power, and propitiations of deities to ensure the success of all alchemical operations. So none of this is found in the earlier work. Many of these elements reflect a Shaiva tantric worldview, and the Rasarnava, the Ocean of Mercury, makes explicit mention of the discipline's affiliation with the Kaula tradition, which is a sort of a Shaiva tantric tradition that focuses on the goddess. David Gordon White noted that the Rasarnava must be read as an attempt to situate the mercurial science, Rasa Vidya, within the broader contexts of Tantric and Hindu doctrine and practice. So this is a little bit of a later development, though quite soon at the beginning of this new genre of literature. So several later works carry this narrative framework of a dialogue between various forms of the god and goddess forward, portraying alchemy as an esoteric science only accessible to initiated adepts. And these works typically feature tantric elements as well. So an example of that would, for example, be the Ananda Kanda, a work that is extremely difficult to translate, the very obscure formulations and strange language. It's also a little bit difficult to categorize just as an alchemical work. It features medicine, and it also features large sections on yoga. But it does deal a lot with alchemical transmutation. So this work has all of these very tantric elements that we find in the Rasarnava. So David Gordon White noted a division between alchemical works that focus on special powers, these siddhis, and bodily immortality as the alchemist's ultimate goal. And these are then linked closely to these Hindu tantras, the works on tantric practice, and works that emphasize increased longevity as a means to the higher end of liberation, following a different kind of Shaivism that's more mainstream, less tantric, and the Rasa Hridaya would be typical of that, except that it's not very Shaiva. And they also have elements of Ayurvedic vitalization therapy or rejuvenation therapy, which is also called Rasayana. And this is a much older tradition, a branch of Indian medicine that goes back 1,000 years earlier to the Indian alchemical writings. So broadly, this distinction reflects the differences between the Heart of Mercury and the Ocean of Mercury, and it's sort of suggesting two lineages of alchemical traditions starting with these early works. But it doesn't quite work that way because later works borrow from both early treatises, quoting or paraphrasing them, elaborating on their themes or echoing their structure. And then they also refer to each other. So you can't sort of discern two different lineages as such, but just the beginning of alchemy has these two different ways of approaching the subject. So while the earliest alchemical works already show a knowledge of medicine and specifically of the methodology of medical vitalization therapy, the so-called rasayana, in their prescriptions for the intake of the mercurial elixirs, they don't focus on the therapeutic potential of their products outside of the elixir regimen, where the restorative and invigorating tonic effects of elixirs are noted. So these are elixirs that are usually for immortality, for superhuman powers, for attaining a transcendent state. But at the same time, they just work as normal sort of tonics. You'll feel better, you'll rejuvenate and so on. However, over time, Indian alchemists showed increasing interest in the medical uses of the materials used in alchemical processes and the therapeutic applications of their elixirs. So going beyond the scope of the initial vitalization and aphrodisiac effects of elixirs, and vitalization and aphrodisiacs are very closely intertwined subjects, always, also in medicine. Alchemists began to extol the ability of their products to treat and cure specific diseases using categories familiar to the Ayurvedic tradition, so to the classical Indian tradition. The perhaps first detailed discussions of disease categories appear in the 12th to 13th century Rasendra Chudamani, which we also have here, and I need to move forward a little bit, see if we can find it quickly. It's always a little bit, here we go, no, one up, I think. Okay, here we have the Rasendra Chudamani. The background picture seems to have disappeared here. So this is the, there it is. So the crest jewel of Mercury, whose chapters 6 to 8 focus on medicinal plants, and chapters 9 to 16 discuss the medicinal use of substances such as minerals, gems, metals, and of course, mercury. So this marks the beginning of a stronger focus on medicine based on Ayurvedic principles in the Sanskrit alchemical works. Then the 13th to 15th century Rasaratnakara, and I should say, whenever I mention any dating, you should know that we're a little bit uncertain about the dating of a lot of these works. So we have a better idea of how they relate to each other, which ones are earlier, which ones are later. But the exact dating is very often not possible. In the case of the Rasaratnakara here, we've said 15th century, but some parts are older than others. It has 5 sections, so some are older than others. It was a compilation done over time. So the Rasaratnakara, which translates as the Jewel Mine of Mercury, dedicates one of its 5 books, the Rasendra Kanda, to the subject of medicine. So we can see here, there's a lot of space given now to the therapeutic applications of these elixirs. And then in the 16th century, the Rasaratna Samuchaya, which I really cannot quite find, but it's in the somewhere here, I guess. Oh, sorry, I moved it to the wrong direction. So the Rasaratna Samuchaya, the jewel collection of Mercury, which is somewhere here. Let me move back a few. This is a work that is usually considered, sorry, we're still in the Rasendra Sangraha. Sorry, this is always the so-called Forfeit effect when you're trying to show something in real time. I'm looking for the Rasaratna Samuchaya. But that work, in any case, is about the medicinal applications of, well, half of the work is dedicated to the medicinal applications of, I can't find it right now, sorry, of mercurial. So we just see this sort of heightening of, first it's a little part of the work, then it sort of expands to being a substantial part. Now it's over half of it in the Rasaratna Samuchaya. And then when we come to a work like the Rasendra Sara Sangraha, which is a work of the 16th century, maybe 15th, maybe 16th century, the entire work is about medicine, but only using mercurials. So it doesn't, it's not an Ayurvedic work in that it doesn't make use of all the knowledge of herbals and so on that that is typical for the Ayurvedic works, but it uses Ayurvedic theory and principles for diagnosis, and then all the medicines contain mercury, and the procedures with which the medicines are made are derived really from even the oldest of the alchemical works. So it's this is the sort of general pathway of the development of the tradition. So generally, all later alchemical works devote a substantial portion to iatrochemistry, but they may also feature other elements, such as the making of artificial gold or the attainment of special powers, those cities that I mentioned earlier. So, for example, and I'm now sort of traumatized by not finding that other work, and I cannot find the next one that I want to show, which is the Rasa Prakasha Sudhakara. Here finally is the Rasaratna Samuchaya that I was failing to find earlier. Sorry about that. So the Rasa Prakasha Sudhakara, the Nectar Mine Light on Mercury, is a work from probably the 16th century. This work is mostly focused on medicine, again, as is typical for the time period, but it also describes all the standard procedures for making mercury elixirs. And it gives, there we go, finally, the Rasa Prakasha Sudhakara. And it gives all the standard procedures for making the mercury elixirs, and it also gives recipes for making gold, silver, pearls, and coral. And the interesting thing there is that for these recipes, these are not put into context with mercury. So you have recipes that use mercury, but you have recipes that don't. For example, in the making of pearls or in the making of coral. So one thing I wanted to show you here about the Rasa Prakasha Sudhakara. So we always have translations of excerpts from the works here. And then on the left, the thing that's not quite loading there right now, but that you might find if you go to this timeline yourself, is a video, because we made some documentaries of experimentations with trying to recreate some of the recipes. So the recipe from the Nectar Mine Light of Mercury for making, there it is now, for making pearls out of fish eyes was one of the ones that we documented. So you can see the recipe here to the right, and you can actually open the film there, which I won't do here now because I think the bandwidth won't really allow me to. But you can find this film and other films also here on our website under Alchemy Reconstruction. And this was a collaboration between myself and Andrew Mason, who is trained in the modern form of Rasa Shastra. So we did some experimentation and some recreation of various recipes from, especially from the Nectar Mine Light of Mercury. So, but back just looking at the timeline, and I don't know, it seems to me as if my computer is slightly stopping, so I hope you can still hear me okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. So.
Okay, good. For me, it's sort of slightly stopped. So one thing I would just like to point out here in the alchemy timeline, if I can move it a little bit because it seems to have stopped, is that the 17th to 20th centuries see a heavy decrease in the production of Sanskrit alchemical works. So you can see this on the timeline. I'm sorry, it's not moving for me, but there's a big gap here where there are no works. And there were a few works that we could have put in there, but really there was so much less textual production in the area that we thought we'd leave it empty to sort of visually show this decrease in textual production. We think that this gap was probably filled by alchemical works written in other Indic languages, including Tamil works, which are a little bit later than the Sanskrit works, but also Persian works. And there I would like to point you to the work of Fabrizio Speziale, who has done some translations of these kinds of works, and also other vernaculars. And also maybe by the incorporation of alchemical methods of drug production in Ayurvedic works. So we put a few Ayurvedic works into this timeline, like the Ayurveda Prakasha, but generally now from this period on, you usually find a sort of iatrochemical section in Ayurvedic works. So, however, in the 20th century, there was a renaissance of Sanskrit alchemical literature. And so it started in the late 19th and then also, picked up in the early 20th century. And both new works on Rasa Shastra were written, but also this was the time when the first print editions of old works were produced. So the new works were typically focused on iatrochemistry, chemical medicine, and they left out any tantric content or reference to transcendent aims or the transmutation of metals. So this is the new kind of Rasa Shastra work. This is indeed broadly the Rasa Shastra that has survived into the present, where it now forms a subdivision of the government regulated education and practice of Ayurveda as described. And this is how it's been integrated into Ayurvedic pharmacology. Apologies for this technological hiccup. It's yeah, one doesn't want it to happen. And anyway, my finishing up was just to say there's a gap between the 17th and 20th century where there was no Sanskrit production. Then they pick up again. First print editions are produced, and then we have some original works too. All of them focus on medicine. So then we still have production up to today with textbooks and so on for the for Rasa Shastra education. There was some experimentation with making gold in the 1940s. What we don't have is any evidence for alchemical practitioners that still are trying to reach immortality or transcendent states. This is something that not that I don't think that people are not still doing it. I think there are still some yogic groups that are. It's just that we don't have any textual evidence for it, or we just don't know about these groups to date. And I think that's where I was going to end anyway. So thank you for listening and sorry for the gap.
I mean, it seems to work fine now. So
yes, this is Dominic's computer, which he has left me now. So
well, I mean, thank you for the very enlightening discussion. I mean, your presentation was very helpful, and I think it helps in situating Indian alchemy a little bit and making it a bit better known, because it's such an interesting domain. And I will start by asking, I mean, one thing that obviously strikes you is this importance of mercury in the Indian alchemical tradition. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you said that there is no mercury in India. So, I mean, I'm just wondering whether they imported it, or I mean, I saw something in Gordon White and David Gordon White about the possibility of there existing some pools of mercury associated with some sulfuric sites, but I guess there was not enough evidence at the time. I don't know if that changed or anyone has been looking at that.
So there's a lot of local stories in India about there having been mercury at different places, and they're usually situated on certain pilgrimage sites, which are in volcanic areas. So some of my colleagues have told me that when they were doing field work, that people said, "Oh yes, we used to have mercury there," and so on. But it's anecdotal, so the sort of geographical surveys and so on give nothing. Then on the other hand, one doesn't need huge amounts of mercury for the procedures. A little bit goes quite far. So it is possible that even sort of trace amounts might have been enough to do a practice. However, I think it's much more likely that it was imported from Afghanistan, or what is today Afghanistan, and from China, so that it was just a product that was brought into India. It's still surprising to think of a whole tradition, and this tradition is very strong even today in South India, and the Tamil Siddha connection, to have it being such an important material if it had to be brought from the outside. So to me, this is still an important but unanswered question.
Right. Thank you very much. And I see that we have quite a few questions, and I'm not sure who was first, so I will just look from the left to the right. So Emmy Warlake first, please.
Thank you, Dagmar, so much for that wonderful presentation. I know next to nothing about Indian alchemy, so these may be crazy questions, and I'm an art historian too, so I look at images, and thus sounds like there's not much that but the images that I can talk to. But I was struck by your discussion of this one text in which Shiva and Parvati have a conversation. And so I was thinking about, most of my work is with the Western tradition, the conversations between Zosimus and Theosebia, and wondering, has there been some work to try to see if that maybe got imported and translated into this kind of conversation, or is a conversation, a dialogue, a typical form of an Indian text?
So the dialogue is a typical form of Indian texts. Actually, from very early on in the Upanishads, you have conversations between father and son, and also husband and wife. But this god and goddess is a typical feature of tantric literature. So this sort of religious text that focus on a particular method of religious practice, the use of mantras, the use of magical diagrams, and so on. And the earliest texts of that genre go back to probably the 5th or 6th century. So of course, Zosimus would be earlier, I guess, and the Greek dialogues and so on. It's perfectly possible that this was an imported format, but I wouldn't see a direct connection between, Zosimus and Theosebia and then the Shiva and Parvati dialogue. So if anything, this would be a larger story of Greek-Indian interactions.
But they also, they come through the Islamic tradition is where probably it would be closer to get that. And this is a very quick question. In a conference at Cambridge in 2014, I heard a very interesting talk by an artist, Anita Chowdhury, who was talking about the importance of cinnabar in Indian painting. And and so since that too was something that doesn't seem to be native, I just wonder, is that a very recent trend or?
No, not at all. So cinnabar was used fairly early on in palm leaf manuscripts to highlight passages and so on, and for some illustrations. And so I would say that, if I was looking actually at the history of the use of vermilion for manuscripts to see if they had something to say about the import of the material, but unfortunately everybody is more or less guessing around on the subject and where it's from. But it was certainly used, so same question there.
Okay, thank you.
So on my list, Ute Fritsch is next. Ute, please.
Yeah, thank you. This was really very interesting and highly astonishing at the same time. So I have some questions which are perhaps a bit provoking. In the European tradition, there's a lot of competition in alchemy and a lot of struggle. And I wondered if the Indian tradition of alchemy was so peaceful, if this is possible, or if there was also competition between the different traditions and argumentation between different schools. This is the one thing. Also relied on the toxic effects of mercury. In Europe, the toxic effects of the use of mercury were discussed, and so the use of mercury or of antimony was forbidden because of this toxic effects on the human body. And for me, it's astonishing to think that there was no problem with the medical use of mercury in India. Was it used today as an oil, or this would be an answer perhaps that it was used as an oil, or the other answer would perhaps also be that the chemical identity is not so clear of this substance. Also, I think this is also perhaps a question of translation. What in the European alchemy, it's not clear what mercury was, and if always mercury was used, if people talked about mercury. And here we have in addition the question of translation, and so it's perhaps not really clear if this mercury was really mercury or perhaps another substance. So these two questions, and my third question goes perhaps in a bit another direction. This would be if the use of cinnabar today in Indian everyday practices like marriage for the married women could have connection with alchemy.
Yeah. So, okay, let's start with competition. I showed you how the earliest works are a little bit different in outlook. You know, one showing is presented as a revealed text, and the other is more like a scientific text. You know, expert speaking to another expert, and sort of this is the scientific discipline, as it were, right? So, but at the same time, they then describe actual procedures that are very similar. So it's exactly the same, except for minus the mantras and the sort of religious context between the texts. And later texts. And you know, we don't have many names connected to the, you know, as authors. We have a few, but all the later texts refer to the earlier ones, and they quote from them, they paraphrase them. Sometimes they don't actually say that they're quoting, but you know that they're quoting because you're familiar with the older texts. And so there's never any criticism in the later texts of the earlier ones. Things are just left out or not referred to. So it's you can sort of see what they thought was relevant by what selection they make, as it were, rather than because of some sort of argument presented. Remember that also those texts that are presented as revealed texts, you can never criticize revealed knowledge. So there's never any possibility for saying, well, Shiva got it wrong, right? So that's God, right? So in that way, you know, we don't see any competition. There is a whole, I forgot to write it in my sort of, when I was showing different traditions, you know, there's a whole bunch of texts that were written within the Jain tradition. So Jainism, the religion of the Jains, they also produced alchemical texts, and they have a little bit of a different nature. Nobody has really worked on them. Nalini Balbir did a few studies on some of them, but the sort of technical works, they haven't been translated. And I wonder whether maybe one would find some competition in there, you know, simply because we're talking about different competing religious groups. Jainism and Shaivism, you know, in the south of India, especially in the medieval period, there was some competition as to, you know, who got royal patronage, for example. And so maybe we would see this reflected in the alchemical literature. But since people have not been translating the Jain alchemical texts yet, we don't know yet, right? So, you know, there's so much more work to be done on this literature that any answer I give now is going to be a little bit tentative. But I think, you know, from within this Shaiva body of literature, we don't see any competition. Now, to the question of toxicity, from the earliest of the text, we immediately, the fact that mercury is toxic is acknowledged. And this program of making an elixir, which in the heart of mercury, this oldest text, you know, immediately gives a program for processing mercury. And this is a process in 18 steps. Well, it's really 16 steps, and then the 2 more steps, which are applications. And so in these 16 steps, the first half are all about purifying mercury. And so, and within these purification steps, the idea is, so the sort of flaws and contaminants of mercury are discussed. And so a lot of these steps are about getting rid of contaminants, lead and tin especially, but also getting rid of inherent flaws of mercury. And these inherent flaws are partly defined as being poisonous. And so, and also its heaviness and so on, but the poisonous is addressed here. And so the idea is that through processing, through treating mercury, as it were, with other substances like aloe vera, you will make it non-poisonous. Right, this is sort of, all of this processing is heading towards making elixir for internal intake, right? So they don't want to poison people with it. In the last steps, when it's about elixir regimen, so the elixir has now been made and proved to be efficacious by trying it out on metals and successfully making gold and silver. We know now the elixir is ready for application to the human being, and now a human being takes it. Now, if there is poisoning, then, so first of all, the human has to be prepared for this intake through a particular diet over a long period of time. And then if they take it and they show poisoning, so, sort of like trembling and other symptoms of poisoning, then they stop therapy and they get some medicines. And it's things like egg white, but also some herbs that are supposed to counter this poisoning. Now, if that happens, usually the idea is that the elixir was not properly prepared. So you have a sort of fail-safe to explain why the elixir is not working. So in other words, they have a very good idea about the toxicity, but they feel they have the answer to it. They can address it through this processing of mercury, and they can address it through the proper application using a particular regimen of application. So this is the toxicity. Now, in modern Ayurveda and Rasa Shastra, they use much less mercury than you would think from the older texts, but it still is an ingredient. And there it's typically mercury sulfides. And so mercury sulfides, usually will not poison the person eating it typically. But however, you're going to find it hard to find studies on the toxicity of modern Rasa Shastra formulations. Not a lot of them are done. They sometimes have some studies, some small scale studies on effectiveness of the materials. So I don't really have an answer about what, how they, what they say today about it, except for that they still have this argument, of course, about correct preparation and correct application that still will hold true for today, but not a whole lot of modern studies. There are some on mice. I don't know of any on human beings. And there was a third one. Oh, yeah, can we be sure that it was mercury? No, we cannot. I mean, if we think of the translation of rasayana into chulen, which means extraction of essences, the word rasa can mean a whole lot of things, like liquid in the first instance, but also essence could refer to many, many things. So we always think that it is definitely mercury because of the way rasa is then described. So one of the things that the alchemical works do is they talk about different substances and they define their characteristics, right? And so the way rasa is described, really shows it to be a liquid metal. So I mean, okay, maybe it could be gallium, I suppose, but let's not forget that this is a living tradition with that is more or less unbroken. And today they're using mercury and they identify it as mercury. So I think it's very, very likely that it was indeed mercury. That would be my answer.
May I ask shortly again? Don't you think that there are perhaps also aspects of an invented tradition?
In what way? Maybe Lucia, could you maybe make your sound? Thank you. Invented tradition. Could you elaborate? In what way invented? Invented by whom?
You told about this gap between the 17th and the 19th and 20th century. And I wonder if this is not perhaps also a sign for an invented tradition to translate Indian alchemy as alchemy, to make it understandable with this word of alchemy.
I mean, I think there's definitely an argument to be made, what do we call alchemy and what don't we call alchemy? If alchemy is Khmer and it's gold making, then that doesn't totally work with the Indian tradition. So, it's a question of boundaries of what we can count as alchemy or not. But the actual texts, the early texts like Rasa Hridaya Tantra and so on, these are texts that were definitely written around this time. There was a big body of literature, and this gap is a gap of Sanskrit literary production, right? So we know definitely of Tamil works being written at that time, and they are closely linked to the Sanskrit ones, same ideas, same sort of practices. And there are definitely Persian texts being written at that time, again, strongly linked to the Sanskrit ones. So there's not really a gap in people thinking about and writing about alchemy. It's just a gap in writing in Sanskrit, which we see for many Indic traditions at the time. So this is a general trend that is not just there in alchemy, though sometimes it starts a bit earlier than it does in alchemy. It's interesting that we have this sort of Sanskrit renaissance in the 19th and 20th century, and that has to do with colonial India and a sort of search for early beginnings and a heightening of Sanskrit traditions as being particularly authoritative and representative of authentic Indian traditions. So that's a kind of different aspect to that. But the practice of alchemy itself, in the way that is described even in the earliest text, seems to have been continuous. They're always within small groups, right? So it's not like it's not like everybody was practicing alchemy.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Sara Norja. I don't know if I pronounced this right. She joins us from Finland.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really great. Very interesting because I've only heard very little about Indian alchemy in the past. I've focused on the Western tradition, like probably most of us here. So my question is related to the sort of theory of matter. So did Indian alchemists sort of have theories on what matter was formed of, and what kind of theories were they? Because that would be really interesting. Were they at all similar to the sort of Western alchemical theories of matter, or were they something completely different?
Yeah, they were something completely different. So it's I'm hoping to do a project in future, and I want to work with Regula Forster, who works on Islamic alchemy, and we were sort of thinking about the mercury sulfur thing. So Indian alchemy also uses sulfur, and can we find commonalities? But as I can see, there seems to be mostly differences. Basically, to start off with, alchemical works offer very little by way of theory of what the materials are. What they do is offer categorizations. What are the metals? So they don't call it metals, they have sort of categorizations of groups of materials that belong together because of their characteristics and how they are processed. But mostly this is set into relation with how they react to mercury, or what they do for mercury in the mercurial processing. So we have these groups of materials that are then used later for Ayurvedic categorizations as well. So the early categorizations that we have go back to Ayurvedic medical works. These are 1,000 years older, right? And they usually have plant materials and so on that have common characteristics. And so we have these groupings, right? What we don't really have is an explanation of why things react the way to each other, the way they do. We have a little bit of humoral theory, which is similar to, but not the same as humoral theory. Well, we don't have this application like in Arabic with degrees of heat or cold or so. So that just doesn't apply, and it's never discussed in the alchemical works. One thing that works that are more similar to the Ocean of Mercury, so that second earliest work that has all these tantric influences, is the interpretation of Mercury as the essence of Shiva, as Shiva's semen. And then sulfur, and sometimes mica, is described as the menses of the goddess. And so they're bringing those together is like reenacting creation. So you're coming back to some sort of prime matter by joining them. However, my sense is really that this whole idea of the bringing together of these substances, of these procreational substances, is a later development that's kind of like propped on top of something to give a sort of later explanation of something, or they don't really have an explanation except for things that they could see happening with the materials. So I would say that in terms of theory of matter, the Indian alchemical traditions don't give us a lot to work with, unlike other Indian traditions. We have atomic theory in Indic traditions. We have lots of ideas of the emanation of the world and what kinds of, with the great elements and the subtle elements and the great elements and how they mix together, and the humoral elements and all of that. But all of that is not discussed much in the Rasa Shastra works.
Thank you. That is super interesting that like the alchemists in particular were just not that interested in theory. even
Yeah, they
though
were kind of practical.
other people were. Yeah,
I was always thinking, you know, what's the day of an alchemist in India? And it would basically be spent grinding materials and then heating materials and so on, you know, but that's what they were doing. They were practical people, from at least from the texts.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
Next is John Christie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much indeed, Dagmar. I find that a very fascinating presentation. And my question is just to do with the term alchemy, ultimately, I think. So much of what you've mentioned and in your group of Sanskrit texts, there's gold making, there's something called transmutation, then there's all the mercurialism. Well, these are things which an historian of European alchemy can relate to fairly immediately. They're not uncommon. There are links with medical traditions too. Again, not uncommon, yeah? But let me try and, how can I do it? Just maybe philologically in the first instance. What is the Sanskrit for alchemy or alchemist? Is there a word as such?
Yes,
that
if
is
you remember, the slide that I showed, Rasavada, Rasavidya. So, you know, the doctrine of Mercury, the knowledge of Mercury, the science of Mercury, or older forms which have dhatu, so metal, instead of rasa, of Mercury.
Yes, but that doesn't, as it were, you know, there are metallists of different kinds. So that is actually something different from what we might signify when we say alchemy in the 13th century in Italy or Germany or whatever. It's those kind of differences I'm maybe trying to get at. And perhaps they could, as well as being pursued philologically, obviously, might they be pursued by asking, it may not be an answerable question, but who were they? You know, if we have our population of European alchemists, but they are not physicians, for instance, yes? They are not this, they are not that, they are this and they are that. They have certain characteristics, and these develop through 15th, 16th and 17th century. Is anything known about who they are?
So yes, but not very much. So it seems that the groups who were more tantric practitioners, so for example, I mentioned that the Ocean of Mercury situates its text within Kaula communities. So these are groups of tantric practitioners. Yes. And so it is very likely that some of the practitioners at least would have been yogis. Right. So in other words, sort of religious communities of people who give up the householder life, right? Yeah. So these are people who are not working within mainstream society, but have different aims in life, and these are usually spiritual aims. So at the time, we would have, these would not have been necessarily people connected to monasteries. However, the descriptions of the setup of the laboratory shows that the alchemists could not have been itinerant, at least not for some of the year, because of needing this quite complicated laboratory setup. They would also have needed patronage, or at least, you know, some sort of money to get access to the materials they were using. So there's a lot of time passes when you're actually making these things. We're talking months, sometimes over a year in the making of something. So we know that they had to have, you know, they were probably stationary unless they then went around and you know, sold their wares, which we don't know about. When medicine, however, when medicine enters the arena, then we have, you know, Ayurvedic physicians using iatrochemical procedures, and they're physicians were really integrated into mainstream society. So they would have had practices attached to temples. They would have had practices, sort of private practices for, you know, villages and so on. So these would have been just people practicing normal medicine and then having particular medications that they would have used. They would have been part of the about the Indian caste system. They would have been sort of quite high ranking within the caste system.
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
But thinking about the comparison to how can we, is there a linguistic connection? So I usually use the word Rasa Shastra or Rasa Vada or so when referring to this tradition. I use alchemy here simply because it's sort of something that has very similar associations. And also, you can make the argument that, if you look at, let's say, Zosimus, and then you look at the Jabirian corpus, you can see many differences, and, think of Paracelsus, and it's very different again, so that the connections even between the Western traditions, the so-called Western traditions, I mean, Northern Egypt to then Europe or so, they are not always as close as they seem to be. It's one of the questions that I remember Regula wanted to ask about.
Yeah. So thanks very much, Dagmar. Most illuminating. Thank you.
Of course, yeah. My pleasure.
Well, I have two questions from Joaquin Perez Pariente, who is asking me to ask it for him.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, I guess you kind of answered it already. What are the main aspects that distinguish alchemical practice from non-alchemical practice? And the other question is, could you please comment on the gold transmutations carried out in mid-1940s in India, which you have briefly referred to?
Yes, that's where everything broke down, right? Yeah. So, the alchemy thing, I think it's sort of answered now. I think the last word on that is not spoken. We may come to the conclusion that it is not appropriate to call Rasa Shastra alchemy. I think there are sort of some arguments to say, because alchemy is a very fuzzy term, that we can still sort of apply it. I see maybe some more, philosophical connections with Chinese Waidan practices, and then again, do we call Waidan, external alchemy or not? So that would be the same sort of discussion. Now, on the making of gold and silver and this experiment, so this was an experiment in 1940 by Krishnapal Shastri, so this Ayurvedic pharmacist from Gujarat. And so Gujarat seems to have been a bit of a hotspot for alchemical practice, so we find sort of various stories there, even from former times. But it was conducted in the laboratory of the Benares Hindu University. And the sort of interesting thing about this experiment was that everybody thought this was successful transmutation. Now, it could have been, sleight of hand, conjuring, who is to say, but the people who were there, and David Gordon White actually describes it in his book, The Alchemical Body, and he met in person somebody who was present at that actual experiment, who has since passed away. Now it's too long ago. It was in 1940, after all. But who said yes, that definitely gold was produced. If I see something that looks like gold, I will not know whether it's gold. But they did do some laboratory experiments on the silver that was produced in the first experiment, and yes, it was silver. So there are various explanations that can sort of explain why was there, double something about, something being underneath the crucible or whatever. We can have various ideas of what happened there and what did not happen. But from the people who were there, everybody considered that they had witnessed transmutation. And so there are these plaques at the Vishwanath temple on the campus of Benares Hindu University. So it's a plaque that says, here in 1940, there was this experiment which did this and that, and it was successful, and we made so and so much gold. Sort of quite interesting stories. And I would point you to David Gordon White's Alchemical Body for a longer description of this. And then the other plaque is at the Birla temple in Delhi. And remember that it was the industrialist Birla who was one of the witnesses to this transmutation exercise. So for me, it's just to show that while alchemy had become more or less medicine at that period, this whole idea of making gold, which is much, much older, and really goes back to these Dhatu Vada times, that we hear about in narrative literatures, that it wasn't completely forgotten, that there were still people pursuing it. And I would note, now we were doing some experiments using, recipes from the Nectar Mine Light of Mercury, which is the 16th century work trying to recreate recipes, and some of them were for imitating gold or for making gold and silver. And I know that we put these documentaries on YouTube, and we get quite a lot of comments on those. And YouTube comments are never going to be very good, but some of them are of people who claim at least to have also done the same experiments or similar ones, and they always criticize our methodology and say, no, you don't know how to do it, we know how to do it. So at the very least, I know that there are still people around in India who are trying to transmute materials, trying to make gold, trying to make silver.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, and we have also a question from Carmen Schmechel, who has a cold, so I will be asking the question. She's asking, what is the role of heat? Is there a more significant role for heat in the alchemical or chemical reactions rather?
Yes, so heat plays a very big role. So when you look at what they're actually doing when they're making the mercurial elixir, they often apply heat, and it's sometimes sort of distillation or sublimation processes that play a big role. So the roasting of materials is a very important aspect. Melting, forming amalgams, forming alloys, and so on is very important so the application of heat plays a really, really big role. Philosophically, it doesn't seem to be, so there's no discussion of what it means to burn something or to apply heat, and this is quite interesting because, of course, India has a very long tradition of using fire for sacrifices and so on, and there's a god of fire, and and it's usually the messenger god to establish connections to other deities and so on. So none of this is ever discussed in the alchemical works. So even though all this heating and burning and distilling and so on is described at length, there's never any sort of theoretical discussion about what it means.
Right. Well, there are no more questions unless someone wishes to ask them. I don't know if I missed anything. There was quite a lot of things going on in the chat. If there are no more questions, what I want to ask is, what are your, this is a very big question, but I have to ask it. What are your thoughts on the connections between the Chinese alchemy and the Indian alchemy? One thing that I, just as a parenthesis, what I noticed was that Chinese alchemy somehow changes also in kind of the 9th century, 10th century, where you have this kind of dual presence of lead and mercury, which seems a little bit similar to the Indian tradition. But again, the question is, where does that come from? And I don't know, but it's a very interesting thing to think about.
It definitely is, and it's So it's something that I would really like to explore. So at the moment, speaking with Regula about, can we make some connections between the Indic and Islamic traditions, and we wanted to involve also someone who was working on the Chinese tradition. So we were speaking with Fabrizio Pregadio, who is the person who's worked a lot on both Waidan.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and so Dom, I don't. Anyway, one of the things that I was thinking about in the connection between Waidan and Naidan is that, Chinese traditions and Indian ones is this focus on making an immortal body, an invulnerable immortal body of some sort through the use of gold elixirs. And so, I mean, this is something that we don't see in the Western traditions, right? So not for a long time, at least, not in the beginning. It's in the Chinese world, we're making alchemical gold, which is then first used to make vessels, to then people drink out of it and they can become immortal. And then later they make the gold elixir that you then imbibe, and that makes you immortal or has other repercussions. So in the Indian context as well, this making of gold and silver is first set into a context where the ability to use the mercurial elixirs to make gold or so is not really for the purpose of making gold. The making of gold is like a test that you then show, yes, now the mercurial elixir is ready for application to the human, for consumption, that will then make the human immortal or give them special powers and so on. So this is where I see this sort of Indian-Chinese connection, or a possible connection. But you're right, when we were speaking to Fabrizio, he was suggesting these new texts on mercury and lead, this different kind of laboratory alchemy. We think that for the Indic tradition, that Taoist ideas for meditation and so on probably played a big role for the Indian traditions of meditation. But again, we don't quite know how. So this is something that we would, I think that's a really big new research project. And I hope that's something that maybe Regula and Fabrizio and I can do in future. But I really noticed when talking to each other about the kind of alchemies that we were studying, and we found it quite hard to find common ground in a way. What would these connections be? And we were thinking, what can we specifically look at? And so we thought, let's look at recipes and what are people actually doing to the mercury or to the lead and so on, and whether we could find commonalities there. And that would be maybe our starting point in this exploration.
And it's also interesting to look at the medical side. I mean, just what they were trying to achieve by means of these recipes. I mean, were they looking for enhanced powers or long life or immortality or escape from this world kind of thing? And I guess it also varies.
Yeah, I mean, in China, of course, by the time, because these are older traditions starting with Gehong and so on, if, by the time, 9th, 10th century, alchemy seems to have been really in the hand of physicians, or at least there were always physicians who also practiced alchemy in China. Whereas in India, the alchemists seem to be separate to begin with. And medicine really only becomes a thing, 200-300 years later. So, these are different groups of people who are practicing, unless it goes back to just older traditions. And, I would think maybe, Buddhist literature might be a place to look. I think, Tibet might be a place to look for, sort of places of connection between Indic and Chinese alchemies and so on. Yeah, there's various avenues one could take for that question.
Okay, I guess we're kind of out of time. I mean, this was an extremely interesting, discussion, and I love to hear about Indian alchemy more. It would be fantastic if a collaboration about Islamic, Chinese, and Indian alchemy would happen. I mean, that would be absolutely great. I want to thank you for coming and for giving this enlightening talk to us. I hope that you'll join us in the future as well. Next time we're actually going to talk about Greek alchemy. Matteo Martelli will be, and some of his colleagues at the University of Bologna will talk about Greek alchemy. So that's another aspect of alchemy that is interesting. As far as I'm concerned, it's all alchemy. I just take a very broad view of it, not too doctrinal about what exactly is alchemy. Mercury seems kind of a connecting link between all these things, but also just, different techniques of harnessing the substances. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
It was great, and let's stay in touch. And thank you everyone for coming as well.
Thank you for listening and giving me the opportunity to speak about the tradition.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.